Hello. Welcome to week 9. This week we're talking about Hiroshima by John Hersey, published in 1946. Just have a few quick things I want to say about this. So first of all, the book originally appeared in the New Yorker. I think I had you read the New Yorker article online in August of 1946. The entire issue was dedicated to Hersey's one article, which is, again, something they haven't done before or since. And this is also kind of the birth of new journalism, where techniques from fiction writing are applied to nonfiction. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind, because I think if you pick up an article today written by a journalist giving like a profile on somebody, the techniques they are using are very much indebted to John Hersey. John Hersey himself is born in 1914. He died in 1993. He's born in Tientsin, China, to British parents serving as missionaries. He was educated at Yale and Cambridge. Got a job working as a secretary for Sinclair Lewis in 1937. Worked for Time magazine and Life. And he was also a prolific novelist. The event of the bomb at Hiroshima itself took place on August 6, 1945. To give you a little context here, the German surrender, ending the war in Europe for the U.S. in May of 1945. In July, the Potsdam Declaration is when the U.S. calls for the Japanese surrender. And it was kind of an ultimatum promising prompt and utter destruction if they failed to surrender. The U.S. drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, killing between 90,000 and 146,000 people. And then a few days later, on August 9th, the bomb on Nagasaki killed between 39,000 and 80,000 people. And again, these are mostly civilians, so people die of burns, radiation sickness, illness, and malnutrition. And then the war did end as a result of these two bombings on August 15th, 1946. So we'll get into some of those, some of the controversy here a little bit later. But I'll post this PowerPoint on Blackboard so you can take a look at some of these photos if you want as well. But this is kind of the immediate aftermath. Again, this was once a city, so you can kind of get a sense of it. But what Hersey does in this novel, I only gave you 2 chapters to read, but he basically follows the lives of 6 survivors, kind of beginning from what they were doing on the morning of the event, on the morning of the blast, and sort of follows them through their year afterwards. So the 6 characters are Miss Toshiko Sasaki, Dr. Masakazu Fuji, Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura, Father Wilhelm Kleisorge, Dr. Terafumi Sasaki, and the Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto. So Miss Sasaki, who's no relation to the Dr. Sasaki, who's also mentioned here, she's a clerk at the East Asian Tin Works. She's 20 years old. She has this 11-month-old brother who's ill. We're told how she kind of has to wake up very early in the morning to kind of cook for everybody in her family before she walks to work. At her job that morning, there's this memorial service being planned for a clerk who committed suicide the day before. And when the bomb goes off, she's 1,600 yards from the center of the blast. She's crushed beneath a bookshelf that breaks her leg when the ceiling above her collapsed as well. Like, people on the floor above her kind of fall into the room she's in, into her office. And her fiance is also away fighting in the war. And when he returns home, he hears that she's been injured, but he does not come to visit her. So there's kind of this devastating, sort of sad effect that this particular narrative has kind of at the end. Dr. Fuji he's the private doctor who owns a hospital that can house up to 30 patients and their families. We're told that this is kind of he describes it as a more traditional Japanese custom, where if a family member gets sick, their family members are also kind of invited to stay at the hospital with them. But he's also been kind of aware that Hiroshima might be a target for a bombing, and it hasn't happened yet. So he's been sort of turning away patients. So at the time, he only has 2 patients at his facility. Um, and his facility is also described as kind of this old meets new world of medicine in a way, because you have these straw mats for patients to sleep on, but the hospital itself also has very modern equipment. So it is a modern hospital, but in a more kind of traditional setting, we might say. The hospital falls into the river. It sort of sits right next to a river as the result of the blast. It is 1,550 yards away from the blast center. His wife is in Osaka at the time of the blast, and in the aftermath, he ends up opening a new clinic, and he hangs a sign in English, quote, "in honor of the conquerors," and he also ends up serving the occupying forces. Which I think is an interesting kind of side note, because it sort of suggests that this response is one where he sort of saw the Americans as the victors in the war, and therefore deserving of some kind of honor. So, the chapter goes on to describe how he works on his English and tries to learn English. So that's one response. But certainly not the only response. Mrs. Nakamura is a widow. She finds out that her husband has died in Singapore during the war, leaving her the single mother of 3 children. And on the day of the blast, she takes her children to a safety area in the East Parade Ground until 2 a.m. the night before. When she wakes up her children, they all walk back home. She turns on the radio and finds that there's still a warning, and that she is advised to kind of leave her house again. But she doesn't want to do it. She's just exhausted. So she puts the kids to bed and she goes to sleep herself. When the blast happens, her house is 3/4 of a mile from the blast center. I believe all 3 of her children survive, but her hair and her children's hair begin to fall out a few weeks after the blast. And in the aftermath, we also learn that she's too poor to see a doctor. So her narrative is kind of this one where, her husband isn't there to provide any financial support. She sort of loses her means of support, and then sort of loses her house also, and falls into kind of increasing poverty and poor health. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge is a German priest for the Society of Jesus. He's 38 years old. We're kind of told these very visceral details about how he's suffering from diarrhea on the morning of the blast, so he's already not feeling well. And he's 1,400 yards from the center of the blast. I think it talks about how he kind of, 1 minute he's in his room and reading, and then in the next moment he's in his underwear out in the garden, doesn't really know how he got there. So he also experiences symptoms of radiation sickness afterwards. His white blood cell count fluctuates. He has anemia. He's feverish, etc. Dr. Sasaki, I think, this is one of the most interesting stories for me. He's a surgeon at the Red Cross Hospital. So we have these, again, 2 perspectives from doctors here. And he comes into Hiroshima on the morning of the blast. He takes a train from the countryside. And he's early. He's earlier than he usually is. And he later reflects that if he had been on time, he would have arrived kind of just as the bomb was going off nearby the train station. And he's certain that he would have been killed. So he's 25 years old. He's a recent graduate of medical school. He dreams that he has a dream kind of on the morning as he's coming in that he will be punished for serving patients in his mother's village in the country without a permit. He's kind of extending his services as a doctor to them. When the blast goes off, he's the only doctor unhurt by the blast. And I think it's important to kind of keep his scenario in mind, because he's this one doctor, and suddenly the entire city, everybody who has survived, is kind of descending on the hospital looking for help. And he's absolutely kind of at a loss of what he can do to help these people whose who's just, are suffering from these burns and this kind of slow, painful death. He develops a theory for the 3 stages of radiation sickness that he sees in patients, and his response to the blast itself is that he becomes very bitter towards the Americans as a result, which again is kind of unlike the other doctor that we see, Dr. Fuji. Kiyoshi Tanimoto is a reverend. He's a pastor of the Methodist Church in Hiroshima. On the morning of the blast, he's helping to move a cabinet, and he's 2 miles from the center of the explosion. So he's probably the furthest away of the 6 people that Hersey covers here. And he survives by sheltering himself behind some rocks in a garden. And he kind of has a moment to reflect on this because he sees the blast happen 2 miles away and has a minute to react. But the guy he's moving a cabinet with, Mr. Matsuo, is killed because he tries to find shelter inside of the house, and the blast knocks the house down on top of him. He also experiences symptoms of radiation sickness, but there's this interesting moment where he's given, a Buddhist priest recommends a moxibustion treatment, which involves the burning of twisted moxa on the wrist of his pulse to kind of reduce fever. Which again, I think is interesting if we try to think about some of the themes here. One of them is like the old world is confronting the modern world. And again, in a sense, this bomb, nobody had ever seen anything like this before. But in terms of the medical response, Dr. Fuji's hospital has this kind of more traditional setting where family members are invited to kind of come and stay. And there's also, Tanimoto's moxibustion treatment, which I think he says actually does work to help reduce his fever. But at the same time, the radiation sickness is something that nobody has ever seen before. And the other doctors is trying to kind of come up with, develop a theory about how it progresses, right? Another theme we might see here is that chance is kind of determining who lives and who dies. Tanimoto survives by just diving in the garden, whereas the man he's moving the cabinet with does not, because he goes into the house. Dr. Sasaki is early, etc. The one thing I'd like you to pay attention to with the writing here is just how cinematic it feels, and by that I mean that he's offering these very minute details and creating an image of what everybody is doing, but at the exact same moment. Like this is in a sense just a book about a single moment, but he gives us all these different kind of ways of looking at it, and through the eyes of so many different people. And then in the end of the chapter I wanted you to read, the second chapter I wanted you to read for today, we're introduced to kind of a mixed response to the bomb. There's indifference by some people, and then there's also outright hatred for America, like Dr. Sasaki. So some die believing that they are doing so for the emperor's sake. Others argue that the total war blurs the distinction between soldiers and civilians, and in that case, the argument becomes, oh, well, these weren't civilians who died; these were people who, were invested in the war, which might be an attempt to justify it, right? And then there's also the argument that using the bomb is justified because it ended the war and put a stop to potentially endless bloodshed or more lives being lost than the some 200,000 who died in these 2 bombings. But I also want you to think about the question of like, what is Hersey's goal in depicting the stories of these 6 characters? Why does he use strategies of fiction to kind of do this? And again, in some ways, this is also just the beginning. I'll post the rest of this PowerPoint on Blackboard so you can walk through it. But the bomb itself, there were some repercussions for the Americans in terms of the bomb, the ship that delivered it on the return back sank in the Pacific, and most of the men were eaten by sharks. But since then, there have also been 2,121 tests of nuclear weapons executed by 8 countries. So this is just the beginning. And I know some of you are writing about this